meeting this evening is entitled Armaments and Global Trade. And nothing could be more prescient, nothing could be more pressing and contemporary than to uncover, to analyse and to understand the impact that the global arms trade has on not just the people that the bombs are dropped on in Palestine and Yemen, but on our own society here as well, which is corrupted by it. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Andrew Feinstein. As many of you will know, Andrew is the author of this book here, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, which was published in 2011 and has been subsequently republished. It was described at the time by the Washington Post as a comprehensive treatment of the arms trade, possibly the most complete account ever written. And I don't think the Washington Post has really maintained its political critique of the arms trade since that time. But the book is more relevant than it was even when it was published. The film, The Shadow World, won Best Documentary at the Edinburgh International Film Festival in 2016. And Andrew's previous publication, After the Party, A Personal and Political Journey Inside the ANC, which was published in 2007, is an account of his time as a Member of Parliament for the ANC. I think you were in the Regional Assembly, Gauteng.
I was in Gauteng briefly, and then in the National Assembly for 7 years. So
he saw really from the inside what went on with the new ANC government, and he's written about it. He also introduced the first resolution in the South African Parliament on the Holocaust, and said that the suffering of Boers at the hands of the British and Jews at the hands of the Nazis could never be an excuse for the suppression and oppression of black people in South Africa and Palestinians in Palestine, in the Middle East. And indeed, that is what we see today, and that argument is raging in our own society. This week and yesterday particularly, we saw the appalling spectacle of British parliamentarians trying to make a genocide all about themselves. So I think this has been this is a wonderful moment, a terrible moment, but a wonderful moment to hear Andrew Feinstein talk about armaments and global trade. And I'd like to invite him to address the meeting.
Thanks so much, Alex. And thank you so much to the library for the invitation. I'm incredibly embarrassed to say I've never been here before. So I'm actually going to spend some time afterwards looking around. And I really feel honored to be sitting here, and behind you, so behind the people I'm looking at, is a banner from the British battalion during the Spanish Civil War, the 35th Division. This place is replete with so much history, sadly also reflecting on an extreme amount of bloodshed. And what I'd like to do this evening is speak for about half an hour on the global arms trade and its place in imperialism today, with a specific focus on the economic foundations of the trade and the ways in which it corrupts our world, undermines our democracies, and actually makes us significantly less safe. So, first of all, it's worth pointing out that I run a very small organization called Shadow World Investigations. There are 6 of us in total. And we've been investigating, researching, writing about, making films about the global arms trade as an organization since 2009. I've been doing it pretty much since 2000. And I'll explain in a few moments how I came to do this work. It's not something I had an instinctive interest in. It's something that was very sadly thrust upon me. Alex makes the point that we've seen in this awful spectacle last night of our own politicians so full of themselves and their own little machinations that they're actually forgetting what last night was supposed to be about, which is demanding an unconditional and immediate ceasefire in Gaza, where tens of thousands of innocent people are being slaughtered in cold blood, using primarily American and British and European weapons. So we are directly complicit in what the highest court in the world has described as plausible genocide. And our politicians really covered themselves in ignominy last night in the way they dealt with it. You know, as Alex mentioned, I was a member of a provincial legislature and then the national parliament for over 7 years. And frankly, I never saw anything like the spectacle we saw last night. It's an absolute disgrace on what is supposed to be the mother of parliaments. It's a reflection of the nature of our politicians and our mainstream politics at the moment. There are people in the Ukraine, in Yemen, in Sudan, and of course in Gaza, who are suffering the consequences, not just of our political ineptitude, but also of the deep systemic corruption of our political system. We have also seen, in a number of these places, the complete collapse of any sort of semblance of arms trade export controls. We have seen the collapse of the international rule of law. We have seen international humanitarian law violated, not for the last 4.5 months, not for the last 2 years, but for almost the last 9 years, as American, British, and European weapons have fueled the conflict in Yemen, where we have provided Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates with all of the weaponry they want to continue to, and please listen to these words, intentionally target civilians in Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world. And I say intentionally target because the vast, vast majority of civilian casualties have been shown by the expert panel on Yemen, by a variety of NGOs, and by an extraordinary human rights organization on the ground in Yemen called Muatana, to have actually intentionally been aimed at places of residence, places of worship, schools, hospitals, places of economic activity. And we know from answers to parliamentary questions that British and American defense forces have been assisting the Saudis in their targeting. So once again, we are complicit in very obvious violations of international humanitarian law. We are in violation in these places of aspects of the Geneva Convention and the Genocide Convention. But let's start right at the beginning, which is, how do we, Britain, export weapons into the world? Well, we are supposed to have a process where, according to what are called the consolidated criteria for arms exports, companies seek permission from the government to export arms to other countries. And included amongst those consolidated criteria, which identify the instances in which arms cannot be exported, includes a criterion that states, if there is an increased likelihood of civilian casualties through the sale of weapons by Britain to another country, then that arms export should not be approved. Now, exports to Saudi Arabia, to UAE, and to Israel violate that criteria. So we're effectively exporting this weaponry in violation of British law, in addition to which it is in violation of the International Arms Trade Treaty that was brought into force as a UN treaty in 2014, and of which Britain claims to be a champion. And our government still claims, as all governments before it have, that we have amongst the most robust and rigorous arms export controls in the world. As somebody who has researched them for over 22 years now, I can with certainty inform our government that in practice, we have one of the weakest arms export control regimes on this planet. So why is this the situation? Well, what my work of the last 22 plus years has argued is that it's because of the economics of the trade. And what do I mean by that? The most important dimension of these economics is the reality that 40% of all corruption in all global trade takes place in the arms trade. 40%. That is a gargantuan figure that dwarfs those economic sectors that we have always assumed to be the most corrupt. Oil and other natural resources, pharmaceuticals, financial services, property and infrastructure. It dwarfs all of those. However, what is most important about this corruption is the reality that the people who benefit from the corruption, from the bribes, what the industry and our governments politely refer to as commissions, what you and I and most ordinary human beings understand as bribes, the very people who create the regulatory environment and are supposed to ensure its enforceability are the very people who benefit from this corruption. Our politicians, their political parties, our military and intelligence leaders, corporate executives in these defense companies, and assorted intermediaries, ranging from financial institutions to amongst the largest law firms in the world and some of the largest auditing firms and consulting firms in the world. And then the so-called arms dealers, the people who feature in the Hollywood films, who are actually either dealers, brokers, or agents, depending on the specific roles that they perform. And very few of these arms dealers are these sort of not very well-dressed individuals scurrying around in the gutters, selling a few weapons into this place and into that. Because those sort of bottom feeder arms dealers, if you will, are exactly the same people who are used by our governments and the world's biggest defense corporations to do the massive arms deals in which most of the corruption takes place. The book that is being passed around is replete with literally hundreds of examples of these sorts of deals and these sorts of individuals. Their primary role is to know which politicians need to be bribed, to what extent, and how to launder the money. They're not the people involved in the manufacture of the weapons, usually not even the transport of the weapons. They're involved in the money side of things. And they are the most crucial people in this collusion between politics, corporate executives, and the myriad intermediaries. And it's important to note that between these various sectors, if you will, there is a constantly revolving door, movement of people. It's a revolving door that happens so rapidly that the person who does the equivalent sort of work that I do in the United States, a brilliant researcher and writer called Bill Harton, after 13 years of trying to track this revolving door, simply found it impossible because there was so much movement of these people. And the United Kingdom over the last 12 to 15 years is very quickly catching up to those very accelerated American revolving doors. Now, when I say this about political parties and politicians, and I should just note here that the book that is being passed around, which is 555 pages long, which I would describe as a tweet, the publishers cut the length by a third, has almost 3,000 footnotes. Why is that? For two reasons. First, this was the first book written on the global arms trade, and it was first published in 2011 and is now in its 10th or 11th edition. The book before it, on the global arms trade, was published in 1979. The reason for that? The information is incredibly difficult to come by, because this entire industry is hidden behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy. And that is the primary reason why it is so replete with corruption. Because our politicians, our corporate executives, our lawyers, auditors, consultants, all know that what they're doing on these deals is never going to see the light of day publicly. That they can do things in the arms trade that they wouldn't dare do, even in the pharmaceutical industry during the COVID pandemic. The extent of the impunity with which this trade takes place is something to behold. A group of researchers at the University of British Columbia in Canada, who I worked with, calculated for the book that there had been 502 violations of UN arms embargoes, companies, countries, individuals selling weapons where there has specifically been an embargo on the sale of weapons to that country approved by the UN Security Council. 502 violations. There have probably been 1,000 more by now. Most of them replete with corruption. Two of those resulted in any sort of inquiry or investigation. One of them resulted in a prosecution. And the arms dealer who was prosecuted, when I interviewed him, described his prosecution as immoral, described the fine he was given when found guilty of violating 2 arms embargoes simultaneously as not really even pocket change. That is the level of legal impunity that this industry is characterized by. So I talk about the parties and the politicians. Well, let me tell you that since the Second World War, by all accounts, and these are difficult numbers to put together, but by all accounts, the defense companies in the so-called Western world have given far more to political parties than any other economic sector. And you pick a country, and I'll tell you the story. Germany, under Helmut Kohl, who funded his Christian Democratic Union for 16 years, primarily on the proceeds of licit and illicit arms deals. The United States of America, where it's a system of what I call legalized bribery, or the United Kingdom, where it is illegal, but happens with a fervency that is truly shameful to behold. What about the politicians? Well, on the most corrupt commercial transaction in economic history, the Al-Yamamah arms deal between Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom, in which 6 billion pounds of bribes were paid. 6 billion. Not just to senior members of the Saudi royal family, not just to Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who received over $1 billion straight into his bank accounts opposite the White House in Washington, D.C. Some of which money went from his account into his wife's account, into the accounts of 2 of the 9/11 hijackers, who were Saudi citizens. In addition to which, Bandar was gifted by BAE Systems a 707 jet plane, kitted out for his personal and private use, and painted in the colors of his favorite American football team. And you'll be delighted to hear that you, as a British taxpayer, at least until 2017, were helping pay for the maintenance and upkeep of that gift. Probably after 2017 as well, but we haven't done the investigation into that. But, before Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister at the time, would sign the deal, her son Mark had to be paid £12 million. For what? Well, nobody knows. Maybe carrying his mother's handbag on a few trips to Riyadh. Maybe making sure she was available to take a phone call when one of the arms dealers needed to talk to her or Prince Bandar needed to talk to her. We don't know. What we do know is that Mrs. Thatcher was desperate to finance her wastrel son, who she didn't want to continue to have to pay for well into his 40s. And of course, just to show that we're completely non-partisan and that corruption in the arms trade knows no party political bounds, Tony Blair, we estimate, probably conservative, has made in excess of £110 million personally since he left office, directly and indirectly from the decision to invade Iraq and from his very close association with British and American arms companies. Let me give you an example of how that worked. Well, how I came to do this work is that when I was an MP in South Africa, I was the ranking ANC member on the Public Accounts Committee, the main financial oversight body, and we received a report from our Auditor General suggesting that our government, the ANC government, my own party, had decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that we had no need of and that we have barely used until today, at a time when we had massive socio-economic challenges facing the country, not least of which was 6 million people living with HIV and AIDS, who our then President Thabo Mbeki informed, unfortunately, we didn't have the finances to provide life-saving antiretroviral medication to these people. Why did we do this deal? Well, interestingly, at our constitutional negotiations leading to the 1994 election, there are a number of people around who are far better dressed than anyone else, and certainly better than us, the facilitators. They were senior executives from the world's arms companies, and they were persuading Thabo Mbeki, who they knew would be effective Prime Minister to President Mandela, Joe Modise, who everybody knew would be our first post-apartheid defense minister, and who'd been corrupt in exile as well, that not only was a huge arms deal a good way to keep the very unhappy white generals a bit happier because you were effectively giving the boys toys to play with, but, like everywhere else in the world, it's a great way to fund your political party. $350 million of bribes were paid. They went to Joe Modise, 2 other cabinet ministers who made the decisions about what we were going to buy and from whom, senior officials, senior military leaders, senior executives in our state arms corporation, and of course, intermediaries. Some of it, I'm very sad to say, went to my own political party itself, the ANC, and that money was used to fight our second democratic election in 1999. Tony Blair made at least 3 trips to South Africa that we're aware of, specifically to sell the BAE contract to South Africa. BAE weren't even shortlisted because they didn't meet the technical specs of what the Air Force wanted. Their option was also 2.5 times more expensive than the option the Air Force wanted. Funny what £115 million of bribes will do. They won the contract. The entire tender system was torn up in order for them to win the contract. But that's what they did with help from Tony Blair. At the time, BAE Systems were paying a total of over £1 billion in bribes in 7 other countries in addition to South Africa. What were the consequences of this? Well, according to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, the policy decision to spend $10 billion on weapons and $0 on antiretrovirals over just the next 5 years led to the avoidable deaths of over 365,000 South Africans from AIDS, led to the birth of 32,000 HIV-positive babies a year because we could not afford mother-to-child transmission treatment. And, as the editor of our then leading weekly political newspaper said at the time, this was the point at which the ANC lost its moral compass. And it ultimately led to a system of what we now describe in South Africa as state capture, in which our then President Jacob Zuma stole 1/3 of the country's GDP every year for the 8 years he was in office, together, of course, with his business associates. But what are the broader impacts of this trade? Well, C. Wright Mills, the American philosopher, describes the militarist mindset that has engulfed the United States of America since the Second World War, that has led the US to be involved in more conflicts almost than all other nations put together since the Second World War. But he said this militarist mindset finds its way into every single aspect of American life. And it's shown most starkly by the almost extreme push to war over diplomacy to resolve real conflicts, but also supposedly to resolve conflicts that never really existed in the first place. To give you an indication of how extreme this situation is, the US government employs more people to run and maintain one single aircraft carrier than it employs diplomats across the entire world. The United States of America has 12 aircraft carriers. Now, why would this be the case? Well, if politicians and political parties are the ones benefiting from the bribes, which are systemic in this industry, you've got to have pretty big defense budgets to ensure that these bribes continue to be paid. And how do you justify ever bigger defense budgets? 2022 saw record defense spending of over $2.2 trillion. Last year and this year set to far surpass that, to ensure that this corrupt circle continues to flourish, financing and polluting our politics all at the same time. Now, Even if one had a very narrow approach to national security, which I personally don't, if you believe all of these threats that we are faced with, if you believe that after the tragedy of 9/11, the war on terror was an appropriate reaction and has actually led to a safer world, rather than the direct death of over 1 million people on the planet. Even if you have that approach, let me give you a quick example of why what this industry does and what this trade does makes us far less safe. Well, the most expensive weapon system ever built is something called the F-35 jet fighter. Now, there's an interesting anecdote relating to this jet fighter, which a Pentagon aerospace design engineer who we interviewed for the Shadow World film describes as the $1 trillion turkey. That's because the film was made quite a few years ago. He'd now have to call it the $2 trillion turkey, because it's cost the American taxpayer over $2 trillion. And according to an Inspector General report of just over 2 years ago, the brains of the thing, the combat suite, just doesn't work. Not fit for purpose. To the extent this aerospace design engineer actually says in the film, the best thing about the F-35 is that the only people it's going to endanger are its test pilots. And he wasn't wrong. It failed its first 14 test flights. And when it was due to be premiered in Europe at the Farnborough Air Show, it never turned up. Why? Because it caught fire on the runway as it was leaving from its US base. Donald Trump believes that this F-35, which is a stealth aircraft, so in other words, difficult to detect on radar, he believes it's actually physically invisible. Now, I don't know if he was reading a kindergarten book that suggested there are invisible planes, but he actually spoke at a media conference about how the Chinese, Russian, or North Korean pilot, depending who his enemy of the day was, when it was flying alongside the F-35, and if the pilot looked to his right or left and there were F-35s on either side of him, there was nothing to be seen because it is an invisible aircraft. This is the man who is about to become president of the United States for the second time. Another very quick example, because I'm running out of time. I might have to go a few minutes over.
Yes,
After 9/11, the American government gave a contract to Lockheed Martin, the biggest defense contractor on the planet, the biggest contributor to political parties in the world. Gave them a contract for $11 billion to modernize and retool the Coast Guard, which was seen as a weakness in Homeland Security after 9/11. After 10 years of this contract, Lockheed Martin had produced one vessel. And when the vessel was launched into the sea, its hull cracked. So that was $11 billion well spent. At the end of the review, after 10 years, which, because the United States has privatized everything to do with defense, wasn't conducted by the government, but was conducted by another defense contractor, Northrop Grumman, who have a whole lot of joint projects with Lockheed Martin. What was the outcome of that review? Oh, well, let's give them a few billion more and a few more years to continue the task. Because that's how it works. And Lockheed Martin regularly charges the US government around $186 for a hammer that it buys at the hardware store inside the Pentagon, which is a whole shopping mall, for less than $6. But of course, there are so many levels at which it is making us profoundly less safe. Because what we really need in this world is not more national security and defense. What we need is greater human security. Because what are the greatest threats facing us today? I would suggest global health pandemics, the climate catastrophe, which will make all of this meaningless, amongst other things. It's also worth bearing in mind that the Pentagon is the biggest institutional polluter on the planet. That conflict degrades the environment more rapidly and more severely than any other human activity. But instead of focusing on these sorts of issues, in a world in which today, for instance, as our politicians continue to play circus in Westminster, in a country where we have a record number of billionaires, but also a record number of people having to use food banks to feed their families at any point since the Second World War, we are spending hundreds of billions more on defense every year, on renewing the Trident nuclear deterrent. Lucky that in the United Kingdom, nobody goes hungry. Nobody has to live without on the streets. Everybody is getting a brilliant education from the cradle to the grave. Benefits are so remarkably adequate. Wages continue to rise. What are we using the money for? For so-called defense. That's not what it's being used for. It is being used to oil the wheels of our political system. And that's the crucial point to understand. So, as this trade launches itself into the glorious fields of artificial intelligence, pioneered, you will be shocked to discover, by the Israeli Defense Force, where numerous illegal weapon systems, both conventional and artificial, are tested on the occupied Palestinian people. Let's think about what we can do about this mess. If we wanted to, we could very easily end the corruption in the arms trade, simply by demanding greater transparency and accountability for the role and use of intermediaries in arms deals. So, if the South African intermediary used by BAE Systems, who just also so happened, by coincidence I'm sure, to be political advisor to South Africa's defense minister at the time, if it had actually been declared that he'd been paid $58 million, and that what he'd done for those $58 million, which of course were bribes to be passed on to others, but he kept a fair chunk for himself, and what he officially did for that $58 million was a one-page summary of the politics and economics of South Africa, handwritten. Clearly couldn't afford overheads like a computer. The actual level of the analysis would have embarrassed my then 12-year-old daughter. Simply by ensuring that every company, every government had to declare what intermediary was being used, what they were being paid, and what they were doing in return for that payment, would make it incredibly difficult for the corruption to continue. Secondly, the other great mechanism for bribes in this industry is something called offsets. And I won't go into that because we don't have the time. But the World Trade Organization thinks economic offsets are so dodgy that it's forbidden their use as criteria in huge public procurements in every single economic sector, except defense. Simply closing that loophole and dealing with intermediaries transparently would cut out the vast, vast majority of corruption in this industry. But who would have to agree to do that? The very people, our lawmakers, who benefit from that very corruption. So if there was political will, we'd be able to do it very easily. But how do we create that political will? First of all, and most importantly, is putting that information into the public domain. Organizations like ourselves, Campaign Against Arms Trade, Palestine Action, who are closing down Elbit factories, very, very important in getting this information that our governments and other companies so desperately don't want us to know about. So getting it into the public domain is the first step. The second step is exerting political pressure. And one does this in all sorts of ways. Look at the tactics of Stop the War, which has been extraordinary in the way it has managed to maintain this incredible movement against Israel's genocide in Gaza. But also think about Palestine Action, Palestine Solidarity Committee. Palestine Action in particular commits direct action against Elbit, which is one of Israel's most important defense companies and had 10 factories in the United Kingdom. 2 of them have been closed down because of Palestine Action's direct action. That direct action also caused Elbit to lose a Ministry of Defence contract worth over £280 million. So here's another very important thing that we can do. I honestly believe that we are going to reach a tipping point where the scales fall from our eyes and people begin to realize how we have been duped for all of these years in a significant percentage of our taxes going to these defense companies to fight forever wars that have brought nothing but misery, immiseration, death, and destruction across the world, while all of us are seeing this very industry corrode our democracies, making our governments and our politics so much more corrupt, and most ironic of all, making us far less safe. Thanks very much.
Thank you.